Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I didn't come to the mountain for omens. I came for dark, dry air and a mirror that would steal photons from interstellar space so cleanly that the data would hold still in my hands. Kitt Peak was good for that. Elevation 6,877 feet. A wind that swept dust off the switchbacks. A ring of domes cool and self-possessed against the Sonoran night. On the afternoon it began, the visitor center had closed early. The forecast called for scattered convection over the Babokivari Mountains, but the sky above us was sharp and pale, the color of bone. By dusk, the humidity fell and the mountain's familiar quiet settled into the buildings. An electric, humming silence you start to hear in your molars if you've worked nights long enough. I was on the Mayall 4-meter that week, DZ on the barrel, 5,000 fiber positioners clicking with insect precision in their curved focal plane. I'm a young faculty fellow with more time on instruments than in front of students, which is fine by me. The plan was routine, pre-calibrations, a bright star alignment, then a long sequence on a high-latitude field. There was also the Perseids in the forecast, which meant the all-sky camera would make a great time-lapse, and the desert highways below would glow faintly with the stream of cars pulled onto shoulders to watch the sky. At 1926 MST, the first anomaly was simple. A ripple on the UPS logs in the control room and a half-second sag from the grid side caught cleanly and carried by the big APC battery cabinets. I noted it. Half an hour later it came again, and then again closer to 9. Elena Ruiz, our site manager, walked in with a portable radio on her hip and a coffee she'd heated on the emergency kitchenette range because half the microwaves were sulking. "You seeing voltage bounce?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Tiny dips. The ATS hasn't spoken yet," I said. The automatic transfer switch was our referee. When the grid got sloppy, it would shunt the site to generator. The generator, a green hulking Cummins unit in the Mayall's service yard, had never failed me in 2 summers. I chewed my pen and kept watching the trending graphs. In the corner, Maya Patel, our undergrad intern from Caltech, was writing notes from the afternoon's instruments tutorial. She'd been all nerves on day 1, steady after that, quick with Linux and patient with the old interlocks. She peered at the UPS screen. "Could it be Tucson?" she asked. "Could be anything between here and the gas turbines," said Elena. "Tua's reporting patchy interruptions on the nation, too." She meant the Tohono O'odham Utilities Authority farther down the mountain. The sheriff's office put out a heads-up. "We'll stay cautious." We did what mountaintop people do. We prepared in small, quiet ways. Jorge Salazar, the night assistant, walked the service corridors and held a talk button to the intercom at each fire door. Call and response down the spine of the building to make sure we could hear one another without phones. I checked the dome's rotation brake and pinged Dave Nakagawa, our chief engineer, who was babysitting the YYN 3.5, meters cooling loop. He answered with a casual "yo," like he did for everything, and promised to swing by the Mayall after he cursed at a stubborn pump for 5 more minutes. Around 2010, the first meteor strobed bright enough to paint the interior of the dome cobalt through a seam. We grinned at each other like kids. The all-sky feed on the second monitor streaked with static for a breath and then cleared. It could have been nothing more exotic than a cheap Ethernet coupler, the kind visitors trip over, but it looked like the entire sky hissed. I made another note. At 21 o'clock on the nose, the ATS clacked. It was a low, unmistakable sound you felt in your feet. The lights wavered, the UPS took the load, and the dome paused mid-rotation as every motor in the building sighed. A second later, the generator took it smoothly. its diesel burr steady through the floor. The monitors blinked alive. Desi's positioning report resumed, a grid of green checkmarks marching. The grid had dropped out entirely. We were on our own power without drama. "You love to see a seamless transfer," Dave said from the door, an oily shop rag tucked in his pocket. He checked the panel anyway because we always check the panel even when nothing is wrong. "Maybe SRP tripped a breaker down valley. Heard there were rolling blackouts last summer when the heat wouldn't quit." It should have been fine. The generator had hours of diesel, and refueling before dawn is as easy as a call if the roads are open. We held the night in our hands. At 21:13, Maya dropped her pen. I wouldn't remember the exact time, but Daisy remembered everything. Later, when I pulled logs from the yawning days, that's what it told me. She blinked hard, like someone snapped a flash in her face. "Can you?" she said, then stopped. Her knuckles went white on the edge of the desk. She took a breath the way one does when trying not to cough in a quiet room. "Maya?" I stepped around the chair. "Hey, sit back for a second." She didn't finish. Her teeth chattered once, twice, like a cold shiver in a summertime room. She raised her hand without quite seeing it, studied it as if it belonged to someone else, and then her left shoulder jerked. The chair squeaked. "Okay, Jorge," I said. "Call for EMS to stage at the visitor center. We'll take her to the clinic." It wasn't a clinic, not really. More a well-stocked first aid room in the administration building with a cot and oxygen and a blood pressure cuff that someone always forgets to reset to 0. "I feel weird," Maya said, and then she folded to the floor. Not even a full collapse, more like a puppet whose strings had quietly lost tension. Her breathing was steady. Her pulse, when I curled my fingers over her wrist, was quick and light. Her eyes wandered, focusing and unfocusing like she was trying to force a 3D Magic Eye poster into clarity. "We don't panic on mountaintops. Panic is a luxury in cities. Up here, there's only work." Elena knelt. "Eyes on me," she said softly. "Can you squeeze my hand?" Maya's fingers twitched. "Good. Jorge, go. Dave, bring the medkit. Asha." She said my name the way she did when she needed me to be two people. "Pack it in the cart." We moved. The service elevator to the ground floor was a metal coffin, and I trusted it, but I still took the stairs. In the hallway, the intercom crackled, then died, then came back with white noise and a twist of voices. I heard the generator deepen its tone like something was leaning on it. Down in the admin wing, the emergency lights had taken over. They turned the white halls into something submarine. We reached the first aid room. The defibrillator case blinked a healthy green, reassuring in exactly the way it was designed to be. We didn't need it. Maya never stopped breathing. She simply drifted sideways in herself. She did vomit, but she rolled away from it instinctively like we'd trained for with fainting visitors. She looked at me a few minutes later, and this time her eyes held. "That was sorry." She grimaced. "I didn't sleep on the shuttle." "You slept on the table?" Dave said, trying for a joke and a breath. He handed me the stethoscope. I listened. Nothing dramatic, just heart working fast, lungs clean and clear. "Maybe dehydration," he said. "It's dry as chalk tonight." The radio on Elena's belt hissed again. She lifted it. "Kitt Peak operations," she said, the syntax that has started 1,000 routine exchanges. "Go ahead." The answer was not routine. Static formed itself into words with difficulty. I recognized the voice. Officer Thomas Antone, Tribal Police, off in the uniform at the base of the mountain on late nights when we came down. "Severe grid failure across the res and West Tucson," he said. "Traffic at a standstill on 86. Keep people on the mountain if you can. We're stretched thin. We're getting medical calls for..." The end of the sentence was eaten. Unusual behavior. Advise you shelter. Shelter on a mountain full of domes isn't the worst idea. We learned that in wildfire seasons, when smoke can come around a bend like a thing with a face. Copy, Elena said. We have one medical event here. Intern with probable syncope. We'll stay put and reassess. Please update when you can. There were two things then, like a stereo track left and right. On the left, the meteor shower intensified. The all-sky camera had filled with chalky streaks, a kind of planetary confetti. The Perseids are friendly. They burn up in the mesosphere and leave us ahs and oohs. On the right, every network device on the mountain began to act poorly in ways that didn't match any failure I'd practiced. The fiber to Tucson stayed up long enough to show a cascade of alerts. Then the route flapped, then it died and didn't come back. The Mayall's instrument control network, isolated by habit and by design, stayed normal until, at 2137, the dome's north limit switch screamed that it had been toggled even though the dome was still. The cryocooler on a guider camera restarted by itself twice. UPS units across the building reported noise on their inputs, then shrugged and did their job. I don't want to dress this up. 10 minutes later, Maya stood. She wiped her mouth and looked embarrassed to be the center of attention. This will be the part that future me wanted to shake present me for. She said she was fine, and I believed her because people get better after fainting and because she wanted to be useful. We put her on the cot anyway. We gave her water. She was never alone. At 22:04, Elena said, "Lock the lab doors." It was a wildfire habit again. Keep fire compartments intact. It was a burglary habit. Keep expensive optics behind doors. It turned out to be our first correct decision for the wrong reasons. Jorge made a loop through the instrument labs, clicking push bars and checking mag locks by feel. At 22:18, the visitor center called on the handheld that only reached the Mayall by sitting in one particular window. "We've got 20 people here," said Tricia, the public programs coordinator. "Most are from a canceled star party. Some drove up before the road closed. A couple are campers from down the road. They're steady. One gentleman seems confused. We put him in the lounge with the lights low." "Keep them together," Elena said. "We'll see how the road looks at midnight. We might go down together if 386 clears." The 12 miles of Route 386 from Summit to the junction with Highway 86 take forever even on a normal day. On a night with brake lights and vehicles stopped in odd places, it would be a siege fought at 20 miles an hour. The part where the intern began convulsing is in the records too. I'm not putting a melodramatic sheen on it. At 22:21, with Dave back in the control room arguing with the temperature sensor and me making the next DC selection, Maya's hand trembled. Then her wrist, then her shoulder. The tremor turned to a tightening, as if every muscle from neck to hip was cinched with a strap. Her back bowed off the cot. She didn't gasp this time. She stared at the ceiling so hard her pupils ate the brown. I rolled her into the recovery position again. My fingers read a fast pulse. Not the thready, shamefaced tachycardia of a faint, but a hard hummingbird work. Her jaw clenched. I couldn't get a tongue depressor between her molars. The seizure lasted less than a minute. Every textbook says a minute is an eternity when you're clocking it in your chest. Textbooks are correct. When it passed, she lay slack and breathing, eyes open. "Maya!" I said it 3 times before they landed. She blinked. It was the slowest blink I've ever seen. And then she inhaled as if just now remembering lungs. She sat up, and then something I didn't have a name for happened in the room. A low-pressure feeling, not physical, more like a shift in the way you notice you are noticed. Maya's head turned and stopped on the far wall, not at a noise, not at emotion. That wall held nothing but a corkboard with evacuation maps and a faded flyer for the solar telescope that had been decommissioned a few years ago. She stared at the blank space beside the cabinet as if a magnet had found a nail in the stud. "Hey," I said, palm up, voice even. "It's okay." She made a small sound, not quite a word. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes were fixed on that spot the way a compass needle is fixed on north. She stood. Then she walked, very steadily, to the wall and placed her hand on the paint. Fingers spread, palm flat. It was such a gentle, deliberate gesture that the hair on my forearms rose like it does when static prepares a trick. She didn't move until Dave said my name from the door, and her head rotated toward him without bringing her eyes along. "I'm calling the clinic in cells," Elena said. She had her phone in the one corner where a bar sometimes existed. "If they can't come, we'll bring her down ourselves." But Cells wasn't answering. The Nation radio channel kept popping with partials, references to traffic control, medical calls, people in the roadway, then the declarative, controlled voice of someone establishing an incident command and requesting more units that wouldn't come because there were none to come. We secured Maya in the first aid room, not because we feared her, but because we feared the building. We were starting to find things with minds of their own. An air handler that switched off and on with no directive, a door that relatched after we'd propped it with a wedge. The mag locks behaved, but we added manual bolts where we could. I'd like to tell you we identified a specific electromagnetic cause, power surges, harmonics, but it was messier. It was as if the mountain's thousands of feet of cable had become an instrument for someone else's song. At 2312, the generator burped. Not a stall, a misfire. We all heard it and held still. Nothing failed. But I unfolded the schematic of the power distribution like a charm against the next thing. The ATS had nothing to add. We switched non-essential loads to off, the lobby, the outside floodlights, the non-critical computers. The Mayall's dome slit was a black letterbox against a star field alive with meteors. For a breath, I forgot the rest of it and felt my profession flood back. A rush of numbers, an index of constellations, the sense that measuring the sky is the steadiest work a human being can do. At 0:01, the first unnatural sound rose from the lab wing. Not a scream and not a voice, something like a slow, hard scrape that comes from inside a wall. I'm not proud of how I froze. Dave didn't. He ran. I ran after him because sometimes you don't get to be your best self before your body commits to a direction. The lab doors we had bolted were still bolted. The sound came from inside the spectroscopy prep room, where Desai's spare fiber assemblies were kept in nested crates. The room was dark except for LED status lights from a bench power supply, sleeping fireflies. Through the small safety window, in the spill from the hallway's emergency lights, I saw movement. There were 4 people assigned to the Mayall that night. There were 5 shapes in that room. "Inventory," Dave mouthed, meaning a visiting tech might have been sleeping on a couch. I shook my head. He pressed his ear to the door. His breath fogged the glass. He listened, not like a horror movie character, but like a man who had spent 20 years learning what machines say when they fail. He stepped back. "It's the cabinet," he whispered. Someone's pushing on the cabinet from the wrong side." Elena reached us with Jorge on her heels. She took in the door, the window, the number of shapes without letting her eyes make contact with any one face. "We don't open it," she said. "We wait." "Who's in there?" I asked. My voice was too loud. It sounded like a visitor in the dome who forgot they aren't outside anymore. "Nobody who should be," Elena said. And then, "We wait." We waited. The scrape stopped. The 5th shape moved to the left, away from the window. with a movement that had none of the flinch of fear. It was a textbook demonstration of momentum, shoulders and hips moving together like a plank. In the dim, the figure's head turned toward the doorway where the metal frame was a darker rectangle. Then it turned back to the cabinet like it remembered something important. When I say infected, I don't mean what movies taught us. I don't mean blood and frenzy. I mean a person with their attention crucified to a fixed point, as if the simplest current in a wire held more gravity than anything their families could say to them. Later, on the road, we would see dozens like it in the corridors of cars, not banging on windows but staring at the glove box latch or the radio dial or the tiny red heartbeat of a charger port. In the labs, the fifth shape stood with their palm on the metal face of a cabinet and waited for something we couldn't hear. We locked every door we could lock. We pulled people to the visitor center, the 20 down there, plus 2 astronomers from the 2.1 meter who had lost the fight with their guider software. We moved through the buildings in pairs under dim headlamps pointed down to protect the sky and our night vision. The meteor shower laced the darkness above us. If you didn't know anything, if you were a tourist with your back to the news, you would have called it the best Perseids you'd ever seen. Inside the visitor center auditorium, we made the world small. Tricia took attendance like a schoolteacher willing order into a feverish day. We distributed water, we gave people a job, turn off your phone unless you're rescuing a message, put a chair against this door, gather all the chemical light sticks and don't crack them. Anyone with a radio license, help me monitor. The worried gentleman in the lounge, a man named Carl from Aho, sat very straight with his hands in his lap and stared at the glass of the closed display case that held a meteorite. It was the kind of souvenir our gift shop sold. The universe in your pocket. He didn't blink for a long time. Officer Antone made it up to the gate around 1:30. He met Elena under the red light porch at the visitor center, footprints crisp in the dust. He wore his uniform with a looseness that said he'd been running since sunset. His cruiser's light bar was dark to protect the day we keep for the sky. Behind him, the switchbacks down 386 burned a line of brake lights held in place by something we later learned was nothing more exotic than panicked drivers who made a series of ordinary bad choices at once. "We have to keep you up here until morning," he said. "The highway is a parking lot. We'll escort a convoy when we can." "What's happening in town?" Elena asked. "Power failures. Hospitals overwhelmed." He hesitated. He had the look of a man who knows exactly how much he wants to share with a group of civilians and is editing his mouth while his eyes tell the truth. "People spacing out," he said finally, "standing in the roadway, climbing fences slowly and steadily. They don't react to voice commands. When you touch them, they grab you and they don't let go." He looked over Elena's shoulder at our quiet people in the lobby. "Keep everyone in small groups. If someone starts stargazing at a wall, get them in a room alone and wait." It was selfish to ask, but I did it. "What is it?" "We don't know," he said. "Stay put. Keep your radios quiet unless you have to speak. Something's chewing up the channels." He tapped his handheld in the porch light. "Anything that hums, anything that glows." The next person to drop was the confused gentleman, Carl. He stood up, walked to the gift shop register, and put both hands on the credit card reader as if praying. He did not respond to his wife's name. When Officer Antone tried to peel him away, he did not resist in the sense of fighting. He simply locked down like a bolts and angles thing. When the officer tried to shift him, Carl's arm twitched like a motor stalled under torque. When Elena held his other side and I spoke to him, his eyes never moved from the little LCD that said "Insert Card." At the end of it, we guided him gently into the office, closed the door, and slid a chair under the knob because you do the things that make your body stop shaking, even if you know they're mostly theater. dawn is always the softest part of the Perseids. The radiant lifts higher. The earth takes fire like a slow match. On the ridge, domes brightened from gray to the color of an eye. We opened the lobby door and let the first breeze in. A woman with a baby wrapped to her chest cried without sound and then stopped because the baby slept. I shared a granola bar with the kid who asked me, very seriously, if this was like the time a crater hit the dinosaurs. "Not like that," I said, "not even close." At 6:10, the convoy started. Officer Antone led in his cruiser with the steady burn of hazard lights. Behind him, 20 cars and 2 observatory vans, then a state truck and a pickup with a family in it, then us in the Mayall cart because it was what we had. We were as orderly and gentle as a funeral. The mountain, kind to us even now, made our brakes smell, but not fail. We didn't make it a mile before we saw the first slow walkers on the shoulder. I will not call them anything cute. They were people, neighbors, who stared into culverts and irrigation controllers and did not answer their names. Most of them didn't step into our path because most of them weren't oriented toward motion anymore. They were anchored to a small thing that hummed or flashed. The ones near the edge of the road turned their heads as we passed and then turned back to the nearest signal. A man in a work shirt with a gas station logo pressed his palm to a transformer box and hummed under his breath in a tone matched to the hardware. At milepost 10, at a turnout with a view east, Tucson a pale smear beyond the ranges, the line stopped. In the road below, someone had stalled a delivery truck sideways across 2 lanes, and then a second driver, panicked, had tried to fit through the remaining space and lodge their SUV like a cork. It would have been an hour of badges and tow straps on a nice day. It would have been 10 minutes with a plow. It was neither. People stood beside their cars now, hands open, dreamy in the heat, and in places they leaned against bumpers and mirrors as if they were touching a thing that fixed them in the world. "Back road," Dave said. He was in the passenger seat with a topo map on his knees, even though he could have drawn the mountain by memory. Fire road through the radio site. It spits out near the picnic area, then to 386 again. "Gated," Elena said. "Master key," Dave said, producing a ring of metal that made me want to cry from love for tradesmen who never go anywhere without everything. We peeled right with a handful of cars who trusted us because we wore the observatory seal. The others stayed put, and that is a sentence that still tastes like ash because I don't know their names. The fire road rattled us half to pieces. We moved a sawhorse and 2 rocks that felt like sculpture, and then clattered down a grade that made my brake foot go numb. Twice we stopped to wait for someone to stare at a trailhead kiosk as if they were reading a familiar fairy tale. Twice we guided someone gently to the shade and a cooler of water, the best and most human thing we had to offer. We rejoined 386 near the picnic area, where we'd once watched a bobcat cross the road like a ghost. Officer Antone had waved the main line forward by then. He saw us, blinked once in the manner of a man already using every decision he had allotted for the day, then gestured us in. 2 miles to the junction, his radio said. Another hour to the highway. Once you hit 86, do not stop unless the car will not drive. If someone falls asleep standing up touching your fender, drive on. Do not touch anyone with bare hands. Do not let anyone new into your vehicle. If your passenger becomes confused, speak to them calmly and pull off gently. Do not run. The highway was worse. A string of brake lights nodded to the horizon. The median glittered in places with the glass of taillights and a scatter of things that people had carried out of habit when they flee. Coolers, a bicycle, a plastic bin of paperwork. Now and then a figure stood in the lane between cars with their palm on a hazard switch, turning it off, on, with an expression of reverent patience. In the rear view, Maya sat very straight. She had slept for an hour. When she woke, she didn't ask questions. She drank water and watched the side mirror as if she were waiting for a particular car to arrive. "Can you hear that?" she said once, and then shook her head before we could answer, and shut her eyes as if to seal the question back inside. We inched. On a dirt road to our right, a rancher in a sun-bleached hat waved people through his gate to let them shave off a mile, then stood aside as an older woman stopped beside his fence and rested her palm on the metal and seemed to forget what motion was. He didn't touch her. He took 2 steps away and kept his arms close to his chest, as if he were thinking about how many things he had learned to do with his hands and how this was not one of them. Near 3 points, a patrol car sat with both doors flung open and no officer in sight. The radio squawked with a dispatch from a voice I recognized from midnights as I crossed town for coffee after the graveyard shift. A voice that soundtracked 1,000 minor collisions and 2 big crimes. It rattled now with calls that had no category code. It told the addresses of houses where people would not follow commands, and of intersections where drivers stopped and left their cars in gear and stepped away to look into the middle distance serenely while their vehicles rolled. We made the turn east toward Tucson. In the basin, the city lay soft under a haze like snowmelt. The grid was a patchwork, some neighborhoods bright, some weirdly dark. The hospital campus glowed steady. If you've lived here long enough, you can read the age of a transformer by the color of its buzz. That morning, I felt like I could read the mood of a neighborhood in the way its porch lights lay on the stucco. We met our first true threat, urgent, kinetic, in a place that had always been harmless. A gas station where the highway met a feeder road. The pumps were dead. The cashier's window was propped open with a shoe. In the lot, 2 men argued gently, almost tenderly, over a battery pack, each with a hand on it, neither raising his voice. When a woman with a toddler on her hip tried to step between them to settle it, one of the men turned without malice and simply hugged the battery to his chest and did not release it. The woman stepped back. She did what our species has learned to do even in chaos. She looked for a mediator with a uniform. A state trooper stood to the side, breathing like a runner. He held his hands out with the palms up. "Ma'am, keep moving," he said. His patrol carbine was slung across his chest, not to frighten anyone, but because that's where it lives. He didn't touch anyone with it. He pointed with his chin. "Keep moving. Eastbound is passable now." We kept moving. In the mirror, I watched the trooper breathe. He looked around in a slow pan and cataloged the ways a morning can unfold and end. By the time we turned toward the foothills, the sun was high enough to turn the domes on the mountain behind us into bright pebbles. The city had gone mostly quiet. My radio pulled in a single station. A classical feed on a backup transmitter playing Arvo Part because fate has a sense of humor about minimalism. In the seat beside me, Elena's hands shook on her knees. "In the back," Maya said without opening her eyes, "it's quieter." "What is?" I asked. "Whatever I thought I heard," she said. "It's quieter when we're away from the domes." She laughed once, not funny, small. "I know that makes no sense." "It doesn't have to," I said, and my voice felt like sand. "You're doing great." At the university, we parked in a loading zone because the only sign that mattered now was the one that said emergency and pointed at the door we all knew from flu seasons. Inside, the lobby smelled like bleach and coffee. A nurse looked at us with an expression that took in triage at a glance and decided where to put her breath. "Confused?" she asked. "One who fainted twice and had a seizure," I said. "Now she's oriented. And a dozen people who are not with us who are—" I searched for a word that would neither panic nor lie. "Stuck." "Get her a mask," she said. "We're moving post-ictal patients toward C." She handed me a paper with instructions printed large enough to read at arm's length. It had boxes to tick for symptoms: fever, cough, rash, confusion. I put an X by confusion because I did not have a better category and because the boxes do not care about the physics of the thing that made them necessary. In the hallway, we passed a man with his palm on a vending machine, humming. An orderly had tugged the machine 2 inches from the wall, and the man had simply followed, palm sliding, humming, eyes fixed. An older woman sat in a chair and stared at an empty outlet with a softness that made me think of how we look at old photographs. And then I hated myself for the thought, because if empathy bends toward poetry too soon, it stops serving. We left Maya in a place with monitors and people who spoke in short, crisp sentences and handed over the log with her times and symptoms like a holy book. When I stepped back into the sun, the shadow of the Mayall reached across the basin like muscle memory. I could find it in the sky by habit, the way farmers can tell you which field is theirs from the air by the tilt of windbreak trees. On that day, it seemed to observe us with quiet disapproval, as if we had let something mechanical slip out of spec. People walked very gently through the parking lot, as if their shoes had been replaced with shoes belonging to someone else who had narrower feet. A man leaned his temple against a lit window and sighed with satisfaction. A woman stood in the grass and stared at the radiator grill of her truck, as if she could tell by thought alone how coolant flowed. I found Elena on the curb with her elbows on her knees. Her radio lay face down beside her as if it had been misbehaving. Dave, who had not sat down since the generator's burp at 2312, stood with his hands hooked in his belt loops looking skyward like you look at a leaking roof. Jorge had his palms tucked under his armpits as if he were cold in the heat. "We tracked the wrong thing," I said, and the words were ridiculous and correct. We had watched the meteor shower with love and a kind of greed for beauty. We had watched the UPS logs with suspicion. We had not known how to parse a small piece of the spectrum that lives between them. A hum that rides wires, a whisper on a carrier wave we don't attend to when it keeps lights lit and doors humming shut. Elena didn't correct me. She handed me a bottle of water she had not opened and said, "We'll go back up tonight." Tonight? I'd had no plans, but the shock of the sentence hit me like a change in air pressure. "Why?" "Because we have people on the mountain," she said. "Because the generator needs to be loved. Because if the domes go unsupervised, they become hazards. Because Trisha is still up there with 12 tourists and 2 docents." She looked at the dome in the sky as if it could hear her. "And because, if we're wrong about what went wrong, we need the logs." In the end, we slept for 4 hours on the floor of an office. I dreamed of the dome slit closing and opening on its own like an animal breathing. When my phone vibrated, it was a message that had been trying to arrive for 2 hours. A photo from the all-sky camera that the system had attempted to email before the network died. In it, Perseid stitched the sky. In the lower left, the Mayall's rounded edge cut a black shape from the stars. In the dome window, you could see a comm room with a corkboard and a faded poster. If you zoomed until the pixels turned into beautiful lies, you could pretend you could see a young intern with her hand on a white wall, as if feeling for a heartbeat. Late that afternoon, the hospital posted a sign on a sandwich board that said, "Please keep devices off." The letters were big and friendly, like a school book. People obeyed in pockets. The classical station played part again. The city hummed. I thought of the paths down the mountain. The main road, the fire road, the foot trails that cut the switchbacks, the dead ends where water barrels sat and horned lizards left tracks. I thought about the lab door with 5 shadows on the inside of a room built for 4. I thought about the way Maya said quieter without knowing how to slap a measurement on it. When the sun tilted, we collected a set of things that do not promise safety, but make your hands feel less useless. Gloves in heavy rubber and nitrile, a pair of insulated hook poles, a bag of zip ties, a first aid kit with a fresh roll of tape, a bundle of chem lights still in their plastic, a coil of rope, 3 radios we promised to keep muted. Officer Antone met us at a temporary command post in the parking lot of a supermarket that had propped its doors open to stay honest about looting. He looked older by a week. "You're going back up," he said, not asking. "We are," Elena said. "Take this," he said, handing her a laminated sheet with phone numbers and a list called "See This, Do This." He touched the bottom of the page where it read, "Avoid prolonged contact with energized devices. Do not touch affected person's hands if they are touching electric mechanical surfaces. Communicate calmly." He cleared his throat. "They're calling it a neurological episode for now, as if that makes it softer." "Does it help?" I asked, and he said, "Sometimes a name is a first coin you can spend." We drove west toward the mountain. The heat left in layers like bandages peeled back. At the base of the switchbacks, 2 cruisers idled with their light bars dark. A trooper we hadn't met before checked our badges, not because it mattered in a metaphysical sense, but because the world keeps its shape with small rituals. Halfway up, a family of 4 carried water jugs from a stranded RV to the shade and waved. A man in a bright running shirt trotted in place beside his car, eyes on the hazard light, smiling as if the flash had told him a difficult joke that, at last, he understood. We reached the gate at dusk. The domes were silhouettes again, familiar strangers. On the porch of the visitor center, Tricia stood with a clipboard and her feet set the way you set them when you're tired and don't plan to fall. She lifted a hand. Behind her, in the lobby, a dozen people sat in small satellites beneath the ceiling, where constellations were painted for children to find. In the corner office, through the door's window, the gentleman who had tried to pay the card reader sat on the floor with his hands open on his knees and looked at the wall just to the right of a framed poster. He looked kind and absent. He looked like a story told in a low voice that no one wanted to interrupt. We went to work. We are small and the sky is indifferent, but we have graphs and keys and a love for systems that pretend to be stubborn but are really just conservative in the face of change. We decided which doors to unlock and which to leave as they were. We spoke softly in rooms that had never cared for whispering before. We walked past panels that hummed and did not touch them. We wrote times down. We checked the generator and laid hands on it not like a prayer but like a mechanic. Here's a filter. Here's a line that sweats. Here's a vibration you can describe in English and fix with a wrench. We put chemical light sticks under a weighted bowl to light the hall without a single LED. We told each other what we were doing before we did it. We made the world a sequence again. In the first aid room, the cot was rumpled. The flyer for the solar telescope had slipped a thumbtack and sagged. The spot on the wall where Maya had placed her hand held the faintest palm-shaped oval of oil you could only see if you got your face within inches of the paint and wondered if you were inventing it. I set my palm over it the way children compare hands. I did not press. I did not want to know whether the paint was warm. We didn't solve anything that night. We kept a battery of machines from tripping into a state that would be harder to drag them out of. We held people in rooms where they wouldn't hurt themselves with the kind of restraint that looks like furniture and talking. We learned to make announcements without the PA and to walk like our shadow mattered. We listened to the generator breathe. Near midnight, in the control room, I heard Desai's tiny motors tick one after another as they walked toward a configuration that would have delighted me any other evening, the mechanical ballet of preparation for a universe that does not negotiate. "We tracked the wrong thing," I said again. Not as a confession, but as a note for a margin, a label on a folder I might open someday when we had less adrenaline in our bodies. Dave shrugged with the fatalist humor of an engineer whose faith sits not in certainty, but in the promise that you can get back to a place where a number lives. "We'll track both," he said. "We're smart." On the monitor, the all-sky camera sent down whole seconds of darkness, interrupted by chalk streaks when the network winked awake. In the lower left, a dome's curved edge made a black crescent. I felt that tender, foolish love again, for machines that do what they were built to do, and for people who keep them doing it, even when they have to reinvent the rules for a night. Out on 386, the road crawled with lights, some steady, some blinking their own tempo, a slow parade of a civilization we were trying very hard to remind itself how to be. At 3:07, Maya called from the hospital. She sounded tired but normal. "Someone brought me tea," she said. "The nurse said I can go home at dawn. I don't have anyone to pick me up." She said it not as a plea, but as a fact that had not yet found its solution. "We'll come down," I said. "We'll make space in the van." Outside, the mountain air moved like a hand in the back of a neck, reassuring. "Sleep if you can." "I can," she said, then paused. "Asha?" "Yeah." "Do you think it's contagious?" She didn't mean the thing itself. She meant the way we were all looking at the tiny lights with a little more reverence than they deserved. "I think attention is contagious," I said, and made a mental note to apologize to my graduate seminar for the metaphysics. "We'll keep ours where it needs to be." She laughed softly, colored by weariness. "You know that classical station that plays at night?" "Yeah." "They put on something that made the monitors sound like a choir," she said. "It was nice. I'm going to sleep." When dawn came again, the meteor shower was a whisper. The city below held its breath. We wrote down our numbers and checked our bolts and counted heads and made a convoy. The road down was ours for the hour it took. In the trucks and cars and vans, people did what people do when they've made it through the worst part of a long night. They told each other small stories, made jokes so gentle they wouldn't scratch glass, left silences in the places they didn't know how to fill. At the junction with 86, Officer Antone stood with a clipboard and a face made of determination and patience. He waved us into the stream. He didn't say good luck because he knew better than to squander words. In my side mirror, the mountain exhaled the new day, domes pale as eggs in the light. We hadn't solved it, but we had refused to turn the sky off. We had escorted people down a road that was still a road. We had remembered that the world runs not on machines or miracles, but on hands that know which amplifier to silence, and which door to wedge open, and which name to say twice, softly until eyes find you. The sign on the highway said Tucson 41. Someone had flipped the cover on it and written in paint beneath, "Keep moving." We did. Whether or not we tracked the wrong thing that first night, we learned to track more than one thing at once. The beauty falling through our atmosphere at 70 kilometers per second, and the quiet inside a room where a hand rests on a wall like a question. We learned which hum was ours to follow and which to ignore. And, this mattered most, we learned to leave the mountain, and then return, not because we had solved the sky, but because the people on the ridge were ours. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.